Hey, so I'll talk about this book, Mystery of the Ductless Glands. It is a book that I just posted on my channel this morning. There's a whole audiobook of it, lasts about 2 hours, and there's a lot of pseudoscience in it. And there is a reason for that. It's because I want YouTube to know what pseudoscience looks like. And I also want YouTube and the rest of the world to know why it's there. There is a reason why pseudoscience gets into these books, especially when it's 1940, which is when this one was published. So, what you're basically reading whenever you read these books is the history of science, not the history of pseudoscience, but the history of science. You cannot have pseudoscience without science. And I want to explain how this sort of personality typing system ended up in this book. Um, you'll have the different glands presented, and then there will be a personality type that is presented as indicative of what this, when someone has this gland really active in their body as the prominent active gland, this is what they look like. And if you've read tarot, you may recognize this approach because often, whenever people are instructed in reading tarot cards, they're told that, well, according to tarot, there is a certain type of person. There's 4 certain types of people. There is the wand type of person. You know, they're often fiery and energetic. They often have red or lighter hair. They often have a type of affectation to them. Well, that's what the tarot cards are actually trying to depict. And they've been trying to depict that for years and years now. And there's a reason why tarot cards are trying to depict this. You know, the Pentacles person, they have darker skin, they have black hair, they have a different sort of affectation to them. Often they'll kind of imply that being a Pentacles type of person is being more heavyset, more muscular, stronger, sturdier, and able to deal with more environmental stuff. Just this person here is a lot different than the King of Wands, and there's stuff there physically. There's certain properties. Well, they thought at the time that certain wands types of people, certain pentacles types of people, certain cups types of people, they have certain things about their appearance that make them different, that set them apart. And this theory developed for a reason. It's because people were observing things. Now, of course, you can tell where this theory breaks down because in the book, they talk about how if you're of a certain glandular type, then you'll often have blonde hair. And we know that your hair color is not determined by your glands. They'll say sometimes that you have like finer, long, strong, glossy hair. And the glossiness of your hair may be something that the glands can help you with. But how the hair is itself is typically that's a genetic thing. Same with the eye color. They said that often the certain type of gland, those people have blue eyes, and even when they don't, they're lighter eyes. But the gland can't affect your eye color. It can affect kind of if you have like maybe if your eyes are bugging out a bit, they're drier, they're more watery and stuff. Actual things happening to your eyes, your eyes' physical condition, those things can be determined by the glands. But your eye color was determined whenever you were like created in the womb. And it was determined according to what your DNA is. It's 1940. Do these people have DNA? No. So what's interesting is that they seem to really jump on this glands thing as this is the answer. And this forms a pattern in the occult over the last 100 years. Usually the occult and science go hand in hand. In fact, the occult is usually supposed to be the place where the secret science or the stuff that not everybody should know or work with is encoded. A lot of that didn't happen because a lot of the chains of custody of information were kind of broken over the last 100 years, either due to war or due to simply people's way of life being kind of no longer in history. You can't be an alchemist anymore, not the way you used to. So these types, they're from tarot, and the tarot types are from something else. The tarot types are from the four humor system that the ancient Greeks practiced, and so did the Romans, because it worked. I'm not saying it worked 100% and it was actually accurate as to what was going on, but the four humor system was responsive to the idea that the liver is responsible for this, the heart is responsible for this. So you have different organs that are responsible for different, like, I want to say personality traits, but if someone is acting very angry and blustery, then it might be assumed that they're having a problem with a certain organ at the time, because the organs were what they could see. Now, there's this title here, The Mystery of the Ductless Glands. And it doesn't really go into what the mystery is, in my opinion. The mystery of the ductless glands is, where are the ducts? And I know it seems like, that really wouldn't impress people. Like, why do people care whether the glands have ducts or not? Well, the thing is, this whole science about glands. Have you ever seen like a old educational film, like actually on a film reel from the 50s or 60s, and you've got kids who are like watching something, like they're going lesson in school, and the lesson is about glands. Like, there used to be this cliche that a boring lesson would be about glands. I cannot tell you how many silly um high school or middle school lectures that people would write into scripts in movies or TV shows that showed, like, this is a boring class, the teacher is boring. The teacher would be talking about the spleen. And that's because all of this stuff about the glands and the spleen was being taught all of a sudden in the, I'd say, 20s to 60s. And the thing is, they started, I'm not going to disproving the gland stuff, but they could never figure out where the ducts were. And the thing about the ducts is, the ducts are telling you how, like, the ducts are where the glands squeeze out their stuff into the body. So there was basically no indication as to how the glands were producing the substances, like, not really how they were producing them, but how those substances were getting to certain parts of the body and when the interactions were taking place, why, where. And it turns out that research was done later on the glands. Actually, the research was done recently, in like the last maybe 10, 15 years, I think. Glands, this is specifically the adrenal glands, this is your spleen, this is basically let's see, the thyroid, the thalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland. All of those glands, they could have been examined in 1940. It was impossible. We can examine them now. And the reason we can examine them is because we have the right medical, not the right laboratory equipment to look at them. It turns out that the gland tissue is so delicate that it's kind of like these really tiny little ducts, actually. They can only exist suspended in fluid. When people were taking gland tissue and putting it under slides for the microscope back in 1940, you take a glass slide, you drop stuff on top, put another glass slide on top to squish it down. Well, the gland tissues got squished down. Like, the ducts were not able to stay open and stay as structures squished in between these two little glass slides. And so, while trying to examine the gland tissue, scientists were actually squishing it. And they did not find that out until recently, when they were able to more clearly examine the gland tissue and see what was there with whatever new equipment they have that doesn't involve squishing everything in between two pieces of glass. So, at the time that this book was written, it would have been impossible to actually look at the gland tissue under a microscope, because the technique itself was destroying the tissue. They got so tired of trying to figure out how glands work that they stopped teaching about it. For a long time, they just stopped teaching it. They started teaching and then they stopped. Actually, the gland stuff gets replaced in the 60s with brain stuff. And you've probably heard about how a different lobe of the brain affects how you think. This lobe does logical thinking, and this lobe does the emotional thinking, and this lobe responds to panic, and this lobe, like, figures out what you're supposed to eat for breakfast, like detects hunger and stuff. All these different lobes That's where all these different thoughts come from. Well, in the 60s, they moved all the personality typing from the glands. They moved all the personality typing from the glands to the brain. And when I say they, I mean Timothy Leary, Robert Anton Wilson, anybody who was in psychology. Everybody was trying to explain this weird behavior. They noticed that people who had certain problems with glands or certain problems with other things tended to have certain characteristics. The thing is, some of this was being equated with things that ended up being birth defects that were more genetic in nature, and people did not have an understanding of that at the time. They saw that the glands were being affected by the birth defects, but they thought that the birth defects were being caused by a problem with the glands. If they just figured out what the problem with the glands was, they would get rid of this thing happening when someone is born. It turned out it was more complicated than that. So this book is trying to do a lot because in 1940 they thought it could. It's all based off of a textbook on glands from 1940. That was what you were supposed to know about glands, and it was supposed to be correct. 1940 was an exciting time. They were discovering all sorts of things in science. We were about to invent the bomb. And a lot of rules about science were being changed all of a sudden as people were able to examine all of these different parts of the body more scientifically, as they were able to use more experiments, use more equipment, different equipment, or more accurate equipment, and better, more accurate ways of testing out what's going on. It's just that as they started testing out the stuff about the glands, they weren't able to find anything of substance to show people data-wise. They weren't able to get the tissue, take photos of the tissue, actually see the interactions in the tissue that were supposedly happening. And without that proof, this kind of exited science for a while. People still talked about glands. I'm sure you've been taught about, like, in general what your glands do, but there's probably been an element of mystery to it, especially if you learned about those glands in school like 30 years ago, like I did. Back then, they still didn't know what was going on with the glands, and it's only been 30 years. So this personality typing thing overlaps with the gland stuff in this book, but it doesn't stop there. That's the thing that I've been kind of, I don't know, tracking in a way, more just noticing. This. So, sorry for knocking the mic. In Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson starts explaining a new way of understanding people based on the brain and the 8th circuit model. And this is something that Timothy Leary came up with that Robert Anton Wilson then followed up on. And do you notice there's 4 types of people? There's 4 types of people that are determined by tarot cards. Yeah, that comes from somewhere. There's 4 circuits that go with 4 types of people, and they go with the 4 tarot card suits. Those are the 4 different types of personalities that are now being explained with the brain circuits. So we switched. Before we started off with like people have noticed people have noticed something about different personalities and medical stuff and other things about them and how they're born and maybe what the illnesses are that their parents had. And so they map that onto tarot, and it sort of works. I will say one of the ways in which it extremely fails is that the tarot basically assumes that you are from Western Europe and that you're not from Western Europe recently. It assumes that your ancestors going back like to 1,000 years have been from Western Europe. Yes, it assumes that either you're white or you're like ancient Greek, or you might be like Spanish and have darker skin and darker hair, but they don't really account for any kind of features that come from Africa or from East Asia or the Far East, for instance. They don't take into account a lot of different features that they know humans have, since these people have actually seen African people before. But they've developed a system that works, and they don't want to really, make it work for other people because those people don't show up enough. That's how they would excuse it at the time. But basically, this system of typing of looking at someone and being like, ah, yes, I can see your fair hair and your clear skin. You are definitely a cups type, and that means that you've got a problem with your liver. Because all cups types have like a fundamental problem with their liver or something like that. Like that's just an example that is not great from how they would interpret it. Well, that's what you would have at the time. You wouldn't you wouldn't really have any way of using that knowledge to talk about people who were more diverse than like Italian. Like Germanic heritage, maybe some French. So all of the people are what we now consider to be white, or they're so white passing that like it's kind of hard to discuss it. The thing is, like a lot of these people could easily be people of color, and this coloring job has done a good job in terms of skin color diversification. I really appreciate that, but largely it's because this is a knockoff deck, and the colors are kind of ugh. In a lot of newer decks, they really give everybody like white peachy skin, and it's kind of awkward. So, all these people are supposed to be kind of like you can look at them and know like what's going on with them, uh, disease wise, health wise, psychologically, because you can examine all these physical characteristics they have that tell you certain things, but they don't match up to all the physical characteristics of humans on the planet because this is made with a bias. It is made for Western Europe aristocracy. That does not actually help when it comes to trying to diagnose people's illnesses or just general traits according to their physical characteristics. You do not have a wide enough pool. Whenever it comes down to the mystery of the ductless glands, people start saying, well, if you have like, a nose that is like really short and stubby and tilts up, then it means that you have this gland is misfiring and you're going to need this kind of fluid from a sheep organ for the rest of your life to be able to correct that. But it says that, and the nose that it describes could be a natural nose on anyone. It's just that they're kind of comparing this mentally to this ideal version of a face in their head, and that face is very white. That face is very European, very Western European. It honestly looks like a good old Roman face. And that assumption carries through into the gland approach. We don't start getting past this. We don't start thinking about different people till the 70s. And Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson start looking at this as a brain thing. Once it's a brain thing, you can't really blame it on the color of somebody's skin. You can't blame it on the shape of their nose. It's all about what's in the brain. So by the time that they start examining this as a brain thing, they start examining it in terms of what's going on in society, because it's kind of hard to ignore what's going on in society by that point. The civil rights era is here, and so that sort of thinking and talking is starting to permeate the material, and that's also why the gland stuff starts to go away, because when you start talking about civil rights, this book gets embarrassing, and every book like it gets embarrassing, and there were so many like it. This was so normal. I cannot tell you how many different like occult societies and magical societies had a book or tract or pamphlet or something about the glands and what they meant spiritually. And in fact, all of them would phrase it as in like, we've figured out this amazing things about the glands that changes everything and will allow you to do real spiritualism magic unfettered finally. That's what this is trying to say, is that like the mystery of the ductless glands. We know they don't have any ducts, but they do so many amazing things, and that's because they're spiritually responsible for this, and this. Um, and the reason why they're able to just kind of load that on so fast is because, like I said, we already had that with tarot. And it's been noticed that there is sometimes a correlation. There are some correlations. Sometimes this is helpful. And if people are using the tarot itself psychologically, like psychically and spiritually, they're getting like all these inklings about different things that a person might need to know or might want to know. So plenty of tarot readers, before laws got put in place against it, would give medical advice. And people were like seeing like there's stuff in here that correlates, but sometimes it doesn't. And that's whenever we just kind of like get flexible. But It's not science at all. It's so easily debunkable. There is some correlation, but it doesn't go all the way, and that's because the four humor system that the Greeks and Romans had does in fact line up somewhat with medical science. They did know that the liver secreted bile and the bile was used to digest things. They did know that the liver was self-healing, that it was it was really the organ in the body that could regenerate itself. If it received damage, it could grow back. So they knew these things about the organs in the human body, and they knew some of the things that would happen whenever those organs would fail, and they would associate that sort of thing with a personality imbalance as well, because sometimes whenever you experience problems with your organs, you do in fact get your personality impacted. But sometimes when you experience problems with your organs, it turns out that's because you actually had a problem with a gland, or sometimes it's because you actually had a problem with your brain. At this point, they are examining that they're finding tumors on certain organs or certain glands, and those tumors are causing the glands to misfunction and cause certain actual illnesses or physical conditions. They're noticing this scientifically, but they've jumped the gun in terms of what it means and how it works. The reason they've jumped the gun is because they have had the gun for 500 years now, at least. That like far longer than that, actually, because the humor system goes back to ancient Greece. Ancient people have been using this medicine for so long, and modern people have improved upon it and have learned more about it. Um, so the reason why this is so impressive when it comes out is because it does start explaining things. The stuff that they start discovering about the glands starts explaining things that they've been told via their esoteric and occult knowledge. This stuff has, the occult stuff has had stuff written in it that says, people who have this trait, they are suffering from this condition, and they're experiencing this internal thing, and this causes this thing to happen in their personality. Um, they find that it works somewhat, and it certainly works more than nothing. By the time that you get to the 60s and it turns into brain stuff, um, they've got some more substantial stuff with the brain stuff, and because the brain stuff is not the body, although the brain does become an extended organ into your body because of the nerve endings. That's something that they discovered more of as time went on. But here they were kind of examining it as you are a brain in a body. Your brain controls your body. Um, and they got a little further. They lost some of the gland stuff, but they gained a lot more knowledge about other stuff. But the thing is, the neurological imprint is the blueprint for the entire organism. Look at these types of people. They're supposed to be like this because of their brains. Musculotonic, the serotonic, cerebrotonic. This person's so brainy they have muscles and they don't have fat. This person's so body focused that they don't really do the brain thing so much. This person's muscular that they don't do either of those other things too much either. And this is trying to explain that when people end up with a certain body shape, it's because of their brain stuff. The gland stuff was actually a better way of explaining it for some of these conditions. So this is in a way a step forward and a way a step back. And it's also why nobody actually practices the 8th circuit model in mainstream school. It's still something that's very interesting and very applicable. It's good to know because if you know it in occultism, then you can kind of see it when it's being used and you understand what's happening with it, why it's being brought in. But unless you know all the background to this, all of this weird science stuff just kind of comes out of nowhere. And I think a lot of people would think, why are these people even trying to be experts on glands? What does that matter? Just let a doctor do it. Well, the thing is, a lot of times these are written by doctors. Unfortunately, this one is attributed to a student. Sometimes they're contributed to by doctors. It's 1940 and there's different standards for doctors. I'm not going to say there's not many standards for doctors because there are in fact many standards for doctors, but not putting out this pamphlet is not amongst those standards at the time. So that's kind of a background on what's going on with Mystery of the Ductless Glands. I'm putting it on YouTube because it is a very representative work of kind of all of the works that we're talking about glands at the time and continue to talk about them. It's really good historical context to understand why people are thinking in this way, why they're writing this, and why they think it's going to help anyone. And I think it also kind of helps you understand, hey, there might be some advice in this pamphlet. It might be applicable, but boy, should you be careful about applying it because it definitely didn't work out to be the right stuff throughout. I think the types, the personality types, are the worst part. Um, all of the photos they show are white people who look like they're from Victorian paintings or something. And that's just not a very good cross section of humanity to base things on. So this, literally, look at this white person from a painting. Do you recognize her? That's a type. This is a type of person. Um, one of them looked. Yeah, this is more illustrative than it is photography, like photography. Um, and I look at this person, and they look pretty identical to the other gland that I showed first, actually. Like, just explain to me the difference between that person and this person. There's not much going on there. So I think that one place where the huge failure in due diligence is that I think anyone could have looked at these pictures they included in this book and told the person, look, I can't tell anything. I don't see how that divides into a personality separate from this one, this one, this one, and this one. But providing a photo, giving physical characteristics, describing a personality of these different types was very common. It was a very, very common approach, and people expected it. I think that most of all, people expected this is the thing that helps when understanding these publications. This pamphlet here is shaped like what people in 1940 would expect at the time and accept at the time. And now we look at it and we're like, ductless glands, what? Um, so you're going to see a lot of these things. If you go into the occult, if you try to find occult research materials, if you try to find occult books on magic, if you try to find it on psychological work, spiritual development, you will find books like this. And whenever you're in a book that is about nothing else, seemingly, you will suddenly find stuff on glands and on brains, depending on whenever it's written and whatever someone thinks at the time is right science. The approach to science where like, hey, citizens don't just get to say what science is, that's pretty new, actually. You have a lot more citizen science happening at the times that these materials are coming out. So that's the context that Mystery of the Ductless Glands comes out of. There's a lot more to say about it, especially when it comes to its medical stuff. And I want to do some research on where science went after this, where it basically went in the last 80 years. Because I think that continuing that story and sort of showing like just how well this book holds up right now and how well it predicted some things. Because, like I said, the gland people predicted that the glands were important. They the ductlessness of actually they were proven right. It was proven that the glands do have these strange, seemingly almost invisible connections throughout our entire body where they release the chemicals and the hormones. And they seemed to be so mysterious back in 1940 that it was thought that maybe they were operating on the etheric level, maybe they were operating on the spiritual level, maybe this was in fact the mysterious ether fluid that science keeps on trying to find because there's no way that a vacuum actually exists. Another thing that was happening at the time is just the idea that there could actually just be nothing there or almost absolutely nothing there, and there's no fluid there that's comprising the rest of it. That was still something that was being debated at the time. Anytime that scientists would put ether to bed, it would quickly wake up again in 3 months. So, um, science work in progress. This a law advice that's 80 years old, and even at the time they were saying we don't quite know how this works, but we see all these things and we think they're pretty cool. So things someone was excited about when it came to scientific discoveries. That's what this pamphlet is doing, and it's trying to match it up to um, all of the spiritual techniques, all of the psychological techniques that they had at the time. because they were really excited. They thought that they had found the answer to the mystery, and that very soon it was going to come out in science how these glands worked. And it turned out it wasn't going to happen very soon because they didn't have the equipment at the time to detect what they needed to detect to be able to come out with real findings. That happened much later. And what's funny, by the time that it happened, nobody was there to talk about this stuff. Everybody in the occult has moved on from glands. A lot of them talk about brains still, but like the gland stuff really not very examined. And so no one really came back and updated and said, "Hey, for the gland stuff in the occult, actually it should go like this according to science." Because no one's really working with this anymore. And that's pretty interesting because the glands, they sound so boring, but they're where your hormones come from, the stuff that determines a lot of your gendered characteristics, like your sex-driven characteristics. They give you energy. They pretty much just allow you to have normal day-to-day life, and they shape a lot of what your normal day-to-day life is like. So it's interesting that occultists have kind of dropped the glands to the side of the road. Um, I I think that occultists really started class magic because that's where the hot new stuff is. So maybe it'll come back to this. I don't know. Maybe somebody will come and revisit this, and maybe somebody will come and revisit this and make some notes on where we were and where we could go. Not sure. I guess we'll see. Nowadays, you have a different approach to the medical, the place where medical and spiritual cross over. People still definitely do books about it. I know you've seen them, but there's different contexts in which it is done now. There's different standards you need to meet, and the audience expects different things now. So that's why you don't see books like this anymore. That's why you saw books like this back then. And that's why books like this are a very interesting part of medical and occult history.